Hi, and welcome to another episode of Studio 411. I'm your host, Larry Dasilva. They say about the 1960s, if you were there, well, you probably won't remember it, but we have assembled a panel of folks that, for the most part, have pretty vivid memories and will be sharing with us some of their favorite and not so favorite moments of a decade that is considered by many to be certainly an important one in our history, the 1960s. Joining me to my left, Professor Philip Guduti Jr., educator, author, historian. He's a professor of history at Quinnipiac University in Hamden, Connecticut. Also teaches U.S. history at Summers High School in Summers, Connecticut. Prior was a freelance reporter for the Hamden Chronicle and the Providence Journal Bulletin. Joining us on Skype, we have Dr. Candy Leonard, author, sociologist, author of Beatleness, now in paperback, the story of how the Beatles' constant presence in the 1960s transformed the childhood and adolescence of millions of fans, and now with a little help from their fans, the Beatles remade the world, and you can go to Beatlesness.com for more information. Joining us from here in Connecticut, we have Dr. Marie Langworthy. Marie, an author, educator, editor-in-chief of New Kabaddi Press. Her website for more information, superwritingservices.com. And she, along with her partner, who have been on the program before, Carol E. Duckworth, she and Marie have written a very successful book, Shifting Gears to Your Career Working Online, Your Guide to Successfully Finding and Claiming Your Place in the Cyber Workplace. And lastly, but not least, joining us from New York, another former guest of ours, actor and director Kenneth Tiger. Again, you know Ken from over 3 decades of appearances in films, stage, as well as television, such shows as Barney Miller, the Waltons, West Wing, on and on and on. The credits are too many to mention even in this hour program. Thank you for joining us. And again, we appreciate you taking time here to be with us. And also, Phil, I neglected to say, Phil's got a couple of books, Kennedy's Kitchen Cabinets and the Pursuit for Peace, and Robert F. Kennedy and the Shaping of the Civil Rights Movement, 1960 to 1964. We'll start with the ladies first. Marie Langworthy, I think when you and I spoke, you emphasized to me that one of the important things that you felt in the decade was the Vietnam conflict.
Oh, well, it was so divisive in our country. And, that together with the Kennedy assassination, really, they talk about the loss of innocence of nations. And I think the Vietnam conflict and the horrible assassinations of Martin Luther King and the 2 Kennedy brothers, coupled with the war, we truly did, in a sense, lose our innocence. It was so different from the decade of the 50s, which my mother relates, and which I've seen in pictures. And the 60s were a watershed. They were no doubt, undoubtedly, they were a watershed year, and our country was a different country after that. Some say for the better, some for the worse. But undoubtedly, it left its mark on our country forever.
Kenneth Tiger, just out of curiosity, I know you were in college in Massachusetts in the late 60s, as you and I had talked about when you were here. Were you eligible for the draft, or did you serve at any point in time?
No, actually, I didn't. I certainly was eligible for the draft. I spent really 1960 to 1970 at Harvard as an undergraduate and then as a graduate student. So I came in 1960 and I ended it in 1970. So for me, the decade was really it was kind of being in a fishbowl, but it was a roiling fishbowl, if you will, fomenting because all of the student movements were happening around me. I was eligible for the draft, although I was very much against the war, and I went to to my draft board, and I told them, don't even think about trying to draft me. I'd rather go to jail. I will go to Canada. I will go to jail. And they said, well, you're in school. It doesn't really matter. And then when they had the draft lottery, my number wasn't very, very high, but it was high enough so that it was pretty clear I probably wasn't going to go. And then I was in graduate school when around the time when I was getting to be a little bit too old to be drafted. But the war was happening all around me, and people in my college class were going off and getting killed, and students were really very upset. And I was actually a faculty member, a teaching fellow, when University Hall was taken over by the students. Mercifully, I was on vacation on the West Coast, and I didn't have to put up with it too much. But of course, it was going on around me all the time, and it was definitely a defining moment in my life, in everybody's life, as we had to finally take stands and figure out where we really stood on these matters.
So in those days, if I recall, because again, being a little younger than you, early to mid 70s, we had to draw numbers, and if I recall, my number was, I don't know, somewhere in the upper 400s or whatever, and we were just about to pull out anyway. But the two ways of escaping was, if I'm understanding, was obviously you were in college, and or other than any physical impairment, would be what would be the other escape?
Well, when I was in college, and I graduated in '64, and by that time, Vietnam really hadn't hadn't escalated. It really wasn't a problem, certainly for me. Then I spent a year abroad. I had a Fulbright, and I spent a year at the University of Göttingen. And right around that time, things started getting worse and escalating, and people were being called up a lot more. And then I went back to Harvard for graduate school, and at that point, I was in school, and I had a student deferment. But as I said, you never knew when something was going to happen, when you were going to get called. It could have happened at any time. And, I was very clear. I mean, I wanted to get a conscientious objector status. They wouldn't give it to me because I was a student, and they had to give me the lowest draft status that they could, which was, for me, a student. And by the time I got my degree, it was 1970, and things were beginning to wind down, and I was 28 years old, and there were a lot of younger men that could serve as cannon fodder for them. So I was pretty fine, but I did participate in an awful lot of anti-war movements and marches, and in fact, I had helped start a cabaret in Cambridge in 1968 called The Proposition, and we did a lot of anti-war material, and part of that, I had a chance to perform at the Boston Garden in something called 11 Votes for Peace for senatorial candidates who were running on an anti-war ticket and platform, and formed really as a fundraiser and to campaign for these wonderful people, Paul O'Dwyer and, Eugene McCarthy was, of course, running for president at the time, and work with them in trying to get us out of Vietnam.
Professor Gooduty, Phil, again, tell me a little bit about, obviously, your research with the Kennedys and what was going on at that time, early to mid-'60s and beyond. What can you add to those statements?
Well, to echo what Mary said, I mean, it really was a watershed moment in American history. It's what really draws me to the 1960s in the first place. You see a lot of different movements sort of beginning in the early 60s, such as civil rights, the beginning of Vietnam. John F. Kennedy increased the troops to around 16,000 in the early 60s into Vietnam. And that, of course, escalates under Johnson in 64 and 65. But Vietnam becomes a very pervasive issue throughout all the 60s, and really that changes how the American people view our government. It changes how people reacted to war, because if you really look at that generation, the one that John F. Kennedy talks about in his inaugural, that the generation had passed, or that the torch had been passed to a new generation. That was the generation that fought in World War II. That was the generation that accepted war and believed that it was their duty as Americans. But if you look at Vietnam, it changes. And I think there's a myriad of reasons why that it does change. One in particular, of course, is the media and the role that that played in the war. But most especially, I think it's just this coming of age for this country, where if you look at the beginning of the 1960s, it's much like the 1950s. And it really isn't until the Kennedy assassination, which is that moment which really it all starts to change. You have the Beatles coming to America. You have just a pop culture completely changed to the point where we start to look at things differently. And with regard to Kennedy, he started to embrace civil rights, which is really the second palpable topic that we see happening in the 1960s.
Candy Leonard, you wanted to add a comment?
Well, certainly the assassination of Kennedy was a transformational event for our generation, for our country, but the coming up of the Beatles, which Phil mentioned, was only 79 years later. So when we look back over history, for all intents and purposes, events really happened in this moment. And so with the loss of Kennedy, young people saw in the Beatles some of the characteristics and qualities that they admired in Kennedy. They were cool, competent citizens of the world. They were about the future. They were about youth ascendancy and youth empowerment. And so the Beatles, again, for all intents and purposes, happened right after that. In fact, when I think about the 60s, I often talk about the Kennedy 60s, which is the inauguration through the assassination, and then the Beatles 60s, which was obviously when they came to America and beyond. And getting back to the war for a moment, a lot of young people, even people who were too young to have to worry about it, were very much affected by it because of older brothers and sisters and kids in the neighborhood. And in my book, there are stories about the kids who used to listen to the Beatles together in the neighborhood. And then as the war heated up, people started to, there was friction about whose family supported it, who didn't. And then, somebody's brother or sister becomes a hippie and starts talking against the war when that community is mostly for the war. So it really caused a lot of dissension, we in families and in living rooms across America. But the young people realized by 1968, 67, or perhaps even earlier, that where the Beatles stood on the war. In fact, one of the people I interviewed for Beatleness said, why is it that all the cool people like the Beatles and the Smothers Brothers and Bob Dylan are against the war? So even young people who were not really old enough to be worried about being drafted necessarily had this sense that you had to have a position, you needed to take a stand on it. It was so pervasive.
John F. Kennedy, of course, we spoke, our guest speaking at length about a quote from him. The world is very different now, and I'm assuming that was probably uttered near the beginning of his presidency, and how, like so many other statements he made, whether it was the space race or you name it, were prophetic statements. So the world certainly did get a lot different. Certainly his assassination and many others, Medgar Evers, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, on and on, Robert F. Kennedy.
I think the assassination of Bobby Kennedy was such obviously any assassination, all three of the ones from the 60s are tragedies. But if you look at the course of history, maybe Phil wants to chime in on this. I think that had Bobby Kennedy lived, we would be living in a very different America today. What do you think?
I completely agree.
I'd like to make a comment about, as we continue about the war issue.
Go ahead, Marie.
There was such an irony, too, because at the same time you had this civil rights movement, and yet in reality, the people who fought the war were all the disenfranchised the disadvantaged, the uneducated, those were the people who went to the war as fodder. And if you were privileged, if you had the right connections, if you had the money, if you were somehow were able to get your kids into college, as in our family, we all broke our necks to make sure that every single young man in our family was enrolled in a college. It was so ironic because on the one hand, we're spouting all this noise about civil rights and the freedom for the blacks, and yet it was the poor and the disenfranchised that were dying over there. There was such a dark side to the war, and there were so many people in this country. The other dark side of the war that we forget was that many, many people in this country became rich on that war and did not want the war to end for that very reason.
That's right.
That's right. One point that, again, I had made a notation of because I find it interesting, and it's probably prevalent in any decade we could speak about, was fear of government. Now, obviously, because of many reasons, such as the not the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, probably folks in certain parts of the country that also weren't happy with the gains in civil rights movements, on and on. I just find that that old saying, the more things change, the more they remain the same. I almost think in some ways we're, have we really gained, and I'll start with Phil Gaduti and then move around the panel. Have we really advanced, in 50 plus years?
I think in some ways we have, and in some ways we haven't. I mean, and that's a thread throughout all of American history, especially when it comes to rights. As you look at the 60s in particular, what it did is it started certain movements that have continued into the 21st century. Let's take Bobby Kennedy, for example, which I agree with Candy, that I think if Bobby Kennedy had lived, you would have seen a different America, because people were really gravitating toward him. Of all the Kennedy brothers, he's perhaps one of the most interesting, the most articulate when you read his speeches.
I agree.
Him and Martin Luther King, especially they were killed 2 months apart from each other, really embodied this ideal of where America was going. So when that stopped, you see America rebelling in some respects. So perhaps we got caught a little bit in a whirlwind. But I find it interesting that in the 21st century, we're still arguing about who can use which bathroom in different parts of this country, when that was a fight that we fought a long time ago, and it shouldn't be an issue anymore.
Right. Ken Tiger?
Have we gone forward or backward? Well, I think we've gone forward in a lot of ways. When you consider that in 1960, there was absolutely no human being, practically nobody, was openly gay anywhere, in politics, in the arts, anywhere. And now we've gotten to gay marriage. I think, yes, we've come a long way. In 1960, you could walk into any bank and all of the tellers were white. And that was just, an entry-level job. But black people could not get those jobs. And now we have an African-American president. So clearly we've made giant strides in a lot of the social sphere.
Well, we still don't have an equal rights amendment for women.
Yes, absolutely. And the conservative movement is trying to push back on all sorts of things. But we have made some progress. On the other hand, a lot of our freedoms now, things that we took for granted in 1960, are gone. For example, I remember when I was a kid, in the 50s, early 60s, there was no problem for me when I was 12 years old, when I was 18 years old in 1960, to get on a bus in Boston and go anywhere I wanted alone. Now, if I were to try that at the age of 12 years old, my parents might have been arrested. we have a lot of freedoms have gone away, both because society has changed and we feel as if society is a lot more dangerous, but also because of now with terrorism, the government has a way of and has a right to control almost every aspect of our lives. They can listen to our phone calls. They do. I mean, whether they're allowed to or not, they do. And a lot of people figure that is the way things are now.
No one's monitoring this
radically.
broadcast. All 13 of my viewers are not. They're barely paying attention. No, I'm only kidding.
I think what people refer to as the culture wars, which is, you started hearing that term, I don't know, maybe in the late 70s, 80s. It really started back in the 60s with the civil rights movement and the student movement and the youth movement, the hippies, where there was suddenly this new ethos of, a new vision of what a society could look like, and a new ethos for personal freedom and self-expression. And that genie's never going to go back in the bottle. And these guys who are pushing that, trying to do that, are going to be made to look rather foolish in the history books.
I agree. I think that the modern world really began in the 60s. The world is completely different from the way it was in the 50s. And a lot of it boils down to sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The world is just different. And people found themselves, and you can't go back. There's an innocence in the 40s and 50s that doesn't exist anymore.
Remembering the 1960s this hour on Studio 411 with our panelists of outstanding guests. A book that was very popular in recent years. 60s people, pop authors Jane and Michael Stern, wrote of whence they had lived. The 1960s, quote unquote, were a moonstruck time where people were smitten with new identities, then discarded them in search of the next one, always looking for the true light and the real meaning of life. It was a time in the 60s where, again, while some facets of our country seemed content with the way things were, I guess, 40s, 50s, and even going back, then we had folks, obviously younger generation, always looking for, not sure what they were looking for, but from all of that came the generation gap. Marie, do you recall generation gap issues in your household?
Well, yeah. It all revolved around the music. How because we were listening to the Beatles and Bob Dylan and Peter, Paul and Mary and the long hair and it was just the end of civilization as we knew it. That's what I remember. And I do remember a terrific gap in our own home. We had problems with our parents, censoring what we were going to be listening to and doing. What has happened to this world? And my mother! I remember my mother thinking that it was absolute anathema that we were abandoning Frank Sinatra. How could we do that? It just was a terrible time. But I would like to say that I think, in answering, going back to what you talked about before about this means that we're better off now, I think people are much more willing to speak out in terms of their own rights. But I am not sure that people have a sense of responsibility as equal as they have a sense of their own rights. Everyone is right out there advocating for their own rights. But my feeling is, I wonder if we have instilled in ourselves and in everyone around us that with every one of those rights there is a responsibility. And I'm not sure in this effort to be politically correct about everything that we have really. I'm just not sure. I don't know. I don't know if better. I think the one thing that has changed our country and the world forever is technology. And we will never, ever, ever be the same. The internet has changed the entire face of the universe, never to be return to what it was, for better or worse.
That's definitely true.
Turning to another topic, again, one that as I was doing the research, and again, was around when this occurred, I thought to myself, again, another example of the more things change, the more they unfortunately remain the same. What was called then the war on poverty, okay? Even as a young adult, I can remember when USA Today in the early 80s came out, and all of a sudden they'd always have certain statistics, graphs, and we used to, I say joke, but not in a good way, almost like astonishment that if it was anything to do with a lack of education, lack of civil liberties, lack of food, poverty levels, Mississippi was always near the bottom of the list. Or if it was the other way around, it was always near the top one
Still
or two.
is.
Still is. And that's my point, is all of a sudden, here we are going on 50 plus years, 60 plus years soon. And again, we still the most supposedly affluent country in the world, and we'll go to Phil next, and yet nothing in that regard has changed. Phil Goodoody.
It's not completely true.
I think this is a great point to talk about. With regard to poverty, that's an issue that really, for whatever reason, in the 1950s and even in the 40s, didn't exist. Well, not that poverty didn't exist, but the identifying it as an issue, you don't read about it, you don't see it until the 60s. And you start to identify for the first time that these issues that people are dealing with, it's because they are impoverished. The book I'm writing right now, I'm looking at speeches from Dr. King and from Bobby Kennedy, just after Johnson announced the Great Society. Those two people identified poverty as the issue for a myriad of problems in this country. It wasn't just about race. If you look at the Watts riots, for example, which is something that the two of them commented on, both of them, both Bobby Kennedy and Dr. King, said these riots, it's not about race, it's about economics. It's about not having the ability to put food on the table for your family, and that took away from your dignity as a person.
And Watts 50 years later still hasn't recovered, and other cities like bigger cities like Detroit, Cleveland are in shambles. Candy Leonard.
I was going to say, what has happened in the meantime? I mean, the Great Society, that's why we talked before about Bobby Kennedy, I mean, the Kennedy brothers helped to put poverty on the map, and then Johnson continued with the War on Poverty and the Great Society programs. But somewhere, as a backlash in the 70s, certainly with the coming of Ronald Reagan, the agenda changed. It was no longer about the common good and lifting people up. We kind of, I think, started morphing into a culture of greed. And so while we still have poverty today, we know there's always going to be poor people. But we know so much about how we could eradicate poverty, or how we could give people more opportunity. But we don't do it. The economy has changed, and the culture has changed since then. I mean, we grew up in the 60s. It was a renaissance. The government had money to do things, to help people, to have a space program, to have free public colleges. It was a time of opportunity, of expanding opportunity and optimism, and that little by little, by the time we get to Reagan, is just gone.
Ken Tiger.
Well, I agree. I think that when we get to Reagan, they were trying to pull back. I mean, the problem is government, you said, and so all of a sudden, all of the infrastructure problems that we have today exist because the government wasn't funding a lot of that stuff. But I agree that it was a different way of looking at things. The 60s, I agree, was very optimistic. People thought we were going to have, once we could get out of Vietnam, the young people were going to change the world, and we were going to have a completely peaceful society, and we were going to do good for everybody. You saw that in the spiritual movements and transcendental meditation, and the Beatles were doing all of that. And suddenly, when we got into Reagan, we were getting into an era where everybody had to have an alarm system in their home, and everybody was looking over their shoulders because somebody was going to come at them. And we weren't interested in society. We were interested in ourselves, but also we had the sense that what was going to help us economically was trickle down.
Right,
And
which is
really
the
what was
biggest
happening
lie and
trickling up.
of the millennium.
Yeah. Also, on these points too, the phrase that always comes to mind is, and I'm not going to name which party. Again, we could get into a whole political discussion that would take us through all the decades. But basically, the phrase that comes to mind is survival of the fittest. You know, like Marie talked about, who went to war, who is fighting poverty. It basically, and certain groups, certain ideologies, basically, oh well. You know, that's kind of the right. Phil Goduti, comment on that.
Well, the whole concept of social Darwinism, for example, that came out in the late 19th century, was really a justification for a lot of the industrialists who made all this money, saying, "Listen, I figured it out, so I'm able to make it. It's just survival of the fittest." Meanwhile, you have these workers making pennies and basically creating these empires for people like Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, and Carnegie. I think the survival of the fittest idea and pulling yourself from your bootstraps, I think you see it in both Democrats and Republicans. And I think part of pulling yourself up from your bootstraps is accepting help and understanding that you're going to need something like student loans in order to get through school. I know for me, I needed student loans in order to get through school. And some of those programs that were a big part of the 60s and 70s made me who I am today. And I think it's one of the greatest things about this country when you really break it down. I don't see it as a handout as much as I see it as helping each person. We are the most affluent society in the world, especially in the 60s. And just coming off of World War II, the 1950s and the 1960s, to have poverty in that society, it's one of the things that John Kennedy talked about in the 1960 election. And Richard Nixon didn't want to hear it. And in the debates, John Kennedy said, "Listen, all I said was, we have too many people in poverty. If we're going to truly be a great nation, if we're going to truly make this country better, we have to at least talk about those things."
In '68, just to give you a little anecdotal, I was in grade school, not quite in high school, and all of a sudden we had a thing where the '68 election, and only because I was the kind, like I was talking with one of the guests that said, they stay up a lot watching TVs or watching things perhaps that they shouldn't have been watching, that their parents didn't know about. In my case, it was the 10 o'clock news. And so I was kind of into everything what was going on from a historical standpoint. And then one day in school, we had a thing where all of a sudden they said, "Well, who do you think's going to win the election?" Well, there was 26 of us in that classroom, okay? 24 of them voted for Humphrey in like a straw ballot thing. One voted for Wallace. I don't know what the deal there was. This is in Bridgeport, Connecticut, so it must have been a transported, Southerner, I don't know. And I voted for Nixon. Not that I had any love of Nixon per se, but the question was, who do you think's going to win the election? And this was after Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated. To jump back quickly, and then we'll go around the horn. Had Bobby Kennedy not been assassinated, and we'll start with Candy, what would have happened differently?
Wow. Well, I think we would have gotten out of Vietnam much sooner.
But would Nixon have had another meltdown? In other words, you're saying that Kennedy would have been elected president?
I believe he would have been elected president, and I believe we would have gotten out of Vietnam. Now, of course, when you play around with history, where do you stop?
Right.
So let's say Bobby won and had 2 terms. That brings us to 72, right? No.
76.
76. So would it have been Carter again? Who knows? I think Reagan ran in 76, maybe. Things go back and forth, but I think that 8 years of Bobby Kennedy would have solidified a lot of the Great Society progress that was made. I don't think we had enough time for that to really gel and become part of our fabric. And we see this now, whereas, again, I keep calling it the culture of greed. It didn't exist then. There was this understanding that, yes, government has a role to, you can't lift yourself up by your bootstraps if you have no boots, right? So that, the idea was that government had a role to play in, giving people opportunity and for the common good. And we don't seem to think that way today. But it's hard to say. Well, the Bobby Kennedy expert should answer this. But I was a big fan of his as a young child, and I read him and I watch his speeches all the time. I find them very inspirational. But I really do think, in my own experience as a young person, I just keep going back to that moment in June of '68 as something real, that it changed the trajectory of our country, I think.
Marie Langworthy.
Well, when you talk about the culture of greed, capitalism feeds on that. Capitalism is all better or worse. The stock market, it's all about greed and stuff. But it is. And there is the other side to that. So, I say to myself, we are the richest country in the world. Why do we have these seemingly hopeless of poverty? And yet, you have people like Bill and Melinda Gates and Buffett and Mark Zuckerberg who have already, in their lifetime, started this movement. Well, it's Melinda and Bill Gates and Buffett, the ones who started it, where they have fled.
Yeah, we're losing Marie. Ken,
before they die. I don't have to do that. I'll tell you, I would do it. I don't think I would do it. But, so, you see the two extremes here. You say to yourself, how can 99% of the wealth, how did this happen? That 99% of the wealth of this country is concentrated in less than 1% of the population. How
with
did
Reagan
that happen? And why did we let that happen?
Ken Tiger.
On the one hand, and on the other hand, you see these enormous philanthropic endeavors. So, I'm not sure I'm willing to give up on the human race here.
Ken Tiger.
Well, going back to, the question was what would have happened if Bobby Kennedy had not been assassinated.
Correct.
Even going back a little further, I truly believe that if his brother hadn't been assassinated, then the entire Vietnam thing would not have occurred. I know that John Kennedy was increasing the troop levels, but I don't believe we would have gotten into the swamp that we got into after he was assassinated. Certainly, if Bobby had not been assassinated, we would have gotten out a lot sooner. And I think I don't know what kind of policies his 4 or 8 years would have brought us, but what it certainly would have done is we had a national psychological meltdown with Vietnam. It was the first war we lost. And there was a kind of guilt, there was a kind of feistiness that came upon the country afterwards, that we had to prove ourselves, and there's been a lot of flag waving in the country because of that. But also there's been a lot of guilt and a huge wound. The Vietnam vets were on the street. They were homeless. They were always with us as a sign that we had failed as a country, and I think that we have a huge inferiority complex that came out of Vietnam that wouldn't have if Kennedy had been able to stop it right there, stanch the flow, move on, and go to a peaceful solution.
Dr. Candy Leonard, Dr. Marie Langworthy, Professor Phil Gaduti, and actor-director Kenneth Tiger joining us here on the Hour Studio 411, the 60s Remembered. A quote from that life force of the Grateful Dead, Jerry Garcia. For me, the lame part of the 1960s was the political part. Was not rather the political part. Let me try that again. Quote, for me, the lame part of the 60s was the political part, not the social part. Okay?
Well, he was a true hippie. The difference between the counterculture and the left, the hippies, the counterculture, they were tuning in and, turn on, tune in, dropping out. They weren't going to participate in the system because they rejected the whole political stuff. That changed in '68 at the convention when there was this coming together, thanks to Allen Ginsberg and others, of this Jerry Rubin, Abby Hoffman, that whole crowd, where they brought the counterculture and the left together to try to, create that power. But there were many. I interviewed young people, people who were hippies or lefties in my book, and they didn't always. They all loved the Beatles, but there were those who were not interested, like Jerry. There were those who were not interested in the politics at all, and they were just about the music, the drugs, the alternative vision of what a society could look like, personal expression, free love, that whole deal.
Phil Gadidi.
Well, to get back to what we talked about, and I know Jerry Garcia talked about how the politics wasn't as pervasive. Certainly, the social life in the 60s was very palpable. But to get back to this idea, if Bobby Kennedy wasn't assassinated, and if his brother wasn't assassinated for a second, Stephen King did a little bit of a novel on this, which is a brilliant novel called 11/22/63, where this English teacher goes back in time to try to stop the Kennedy assassination. What could have happened? Big piece of it was, in fact, Vietnam. Scholars have actually done studies on this to see if Kennedy would have gone into Vietnam in the same way that Johnson did. And it seems as if, now remember, both Johnson and Kennedy had the same exact advisors. The biggest difference between Kennedy and Johnson was one, of course, that they were two different people and how they approached the presidency was totally different. The second thing was one of the key advisors to John F. Kennedy was his brother, Robert F. Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy was not in the room after the Gulf of Tonkin incident. He was not a part of the discussion for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, nor was he a part of the discussion. He had resigned from Attorney General a little later into '64. In August 1964, he decided to run for the Senate seat. And then so in '65, when the fighting really got worse, around February, he had just taken his Senate seat. He wasn't a part of any of those discussions. He and Johnson did not get along, so Johnson didn't want him a part of those discussions anyway. So a key person, when you look at the 1960s and you look at something like the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, where we almost went to war with the Soviet Union, and you had people in that room that advised President Kennedy whether or not he was going to bomb Cuba. Those same people were there for Vietnam, but they acted differently. Why? That's what a lot of scholars ask. And the truth is, the key point there is John F. Kennedy. He had the forbearance enough to stand up to the military and say, look, we're not going into Cuba. We're going to hold off. And chances are he would have said the same thing about Vietnam.
And also, the gentleman that kind of took over as the point man for Johnson, correct me if I'm wrong, Robert McNamara, who in effect wasn't even a politician, was a Ford executive at one point, so he was trying to run the war like he was running a business or a production line.
Well, the Vietnam War made a lot of money for a lot of American corporations, as war always does. Put very eloquently by Bob Dylan in Masters of War. War is, and look at Iraq, look at the Cheney and Halliburton. It goes on and on and on.
So many of our young people are so disillusioned because they see through this mask.
Right.
They see it for what it is.
Ken Tiger.
I've done the war. I want to go back to the social aspect because one thing, the word drugs has come up a bit, but I think that it's really very major when we talk about the 60s. And the music was certainly there, the hippie movement, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But if you look at the world before, in the early 60s, the drugs weren't there. I was in college, nobody was doing drugs. I went away in 1964 to 65 to Europe, and when I came back, drugs were everywhere.
That's because Rubber Soul had come out.
In that period, and it changed everybody's viewpoint. Everybody was different. They were much more interested in spiritual things. I'm not, but the world was. They were much more interested in discovering who they were. They were much more socially engaged. When I first went to college in 1960, there was one political group at Harvard. It was called Toxin. It was a banned bomb organization. By 1970, there were political movements all over the place, and a lot of that happened because people were taking drugs and they were discovering that there was an entire world out there that they didn't know anything about and that they had to grasp on. And I think, again, the world changed radically in 1964, 1965, and that was one of the things that was happening there.
We have a great panel of guests joining us here discussing and remembering the 1960s for the hour here on Studio 411 in our remaining moments. One thing, without getting too much into today's political climate, just kind of whether you agree or disagree, at one point, and I'm not sure because it keeps changing, like Marie said with the internet, things change on a heartbeat, but at one point during this race, I saw a similarity between kind of like when Johnson, who of course was the incumbent president, if you want to call it that, whatever, because of Kennedy's assassination, basically going up against Goldwater, and then there was this pretty much a landslide victory for many reasons. Okay, I'm not saying the comparisons are all there, but do you see any similarity, and we'll start with Phil and work our way around, short answer please. Do you see any correlation to like what's going on now, that we could have another situation like that in this country with the elections of recent vintage, or am I just not seeing it clearly? Phil?
I don't really have a short answer to that.
Okay.
I think
Ken.
the election that we're seeing play out right now, I mean, it's different. I mean, what happened with the Republican Party and with Donald Trump, or what is happening, I should say, is something that it's not unprecedented. I mean, we saw it with William Howard Taft and Teddy Roosevelt. We saw basically the party go in, disarray in 1912. You're seeing a similar thing going on with the Republicans right now. But I think on a larger note, what you're seeing in this election is that there is a certain movement, a populist movement, for lack of a better term, right? A populist movement in both the Democratic and Republican parties, where they are going against the establishment and they're looking at other alternatives, and with that comes a redefinition of the parties.
Candy, short answer please.
Well, it's anybody's guess how all this is going to turn out, but I think that one thing I will say about Bernie Sanders, people made fun of, they always sort of characterize him as an old hippie and all this, but in fact, the Democratic Socialist platform, this is really not very radical. I mean, even Eisenhower, the tax rate under Eisenhower was something like 90%. So a lot of the progressive Democratic platform is really wanting to go back and finish some of that work that didn't get finished in the 60s that would benefit everybody, not just the well-off.
Would you say that Bernie Sanders is yesterday's Eugene McCarthy?
I think so. I mean, that's one way of putting it. Yeah, I think so. I think so. But, with the media and the short news cycle and the internet, like everybody on the panel has been saying, everything is different, and it's really hard to predict what's going to happen.
John Lennon, who of course is quoted quite a bit, it's amazing when one passes. I guess a lot of folks become very wise, maybe than we've ever realized. A quote that he had, quote, "The thing the 60s did was to show us the possibilities and the responsibility that we all had. It wasn't the answer, it just gave us a glimpse of the possibility."
Who said that? That was John Lennon?
John Lennon, yes. You should know that, Candy.
That's what I thought. That I didn't. Yes.
Marie.
Imagine.
Marie Langworthy.
Yeah. You know what? The fact of the matter is, people stand for leadership. They want somebody. American people are not stupid. They want somebody with integrity and competence, and they are starved for that. They don't care whether they're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent or a socialist. That's what they're looking for. And that's why people are jumping ship. Republicans are jumping ship to one side, Democrats to the other. They're starved for leadership.
And now in '64, basically everybody just followed the party platform and went to slaughter with Barry Goldwater, who was not a bad man. It's just that, again, obviously, just was not, was
Today's
not a good
Help
situation.
Oh, except for
Party
the
would
South.
throw him out.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. In our remaining moments, talking with our fine panel of guests here on this episode of Studio 411, remembering the '60s. What were some of the catchphrases I thought of? But with the conversation going to such.
Question authority.
I'm sorry.
Question authority.
Oh, what? Yeah, okay. No, I wasn't questioning that. I was just going to
No,
say.
I'm saying that was one of the important expressions.
Oh, okay, that's right. And actually, I have a list of some other ones, catchphrases that probably ad men in our country of ours were certainly trying to, to entice folks. Does she or doesn't she? You remember that, Miss Clairol?
Remember Miss Love Now?
Why don't you pick one up and smoke it sometime? That was the fabulous Edie Adams with Dutch Master Cigar. And of course you had the Noxema, remember that? Take it off, take it all off. Again, these were all like great ad campaigns, which reminds me of a show that some of you may have seen. I was not a watcher of it, but Mad Men, which very accurately captured the look and the feel of the 1960s. Where people would smoke in their offices, people had a bottle of whiskey or
It
whatever.
also captured the stifling conformity and lack of authenticity.
Okay.
And all that got blown away after the Beatles came.
There you go. There you go. Space race, of course. John Kennedy, again, in the remaining moments we have, predicted accurately that we'd someday put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, and lo and behold, after despite a few tragedies along the way, we did succeed with that, didn't we, Phil?
We did, and the irony of it is the man who ran against him, Richard Nixon, was the guy who was in the White House when we did actually land on the moon with Apollo 11. I mean, that was a Cold War measure. We spent a lot of money to get to the moon so we can beat the Soviets to the moon. But I think from that we see how American innovation can do just about anything. And
It was a very proud moment. I mean, with all the turmoil of the '60s, I think it really brought people together when that happened. And even though it was perhaps part of the Cold War effort, it was still an amazing moment for humanity, and it brought people together in a very powerful way.
Ken Tiger, in your opinion, just quick answer, the most influential person of the '60s. Quick answer.
Oh, I think it was John Kennedy.
Candy Leonard.
Well, that's a toughie. I might want to say Bob Dylan or John Lennon.
Phil.
oh, I'd say Kennedy too.
Marie Langworthy.
Kennedys.
Kennedy. All right, so 3 Kennedys and a split between Dylan and who was the other one?
John Lennon.
John Lennon. There you
Man
go.
just
All right.
quoted the man who terrified Richard Nixon so much that he had the FBI follow him for years.
Well, everybody terrified Nixon, but that's for another decade. All right, so actually we could cover him from the '50s.
Martin Luther King.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, Dr.
Absolutely.
King. Definitely.
All right. Well, as we come to the end of this marvelous discussion, as I said to our guests when we were lining this up, trying to do a 10-year period that was as filled of ups and downs and lefts and rights as the '60s. Of course, we try to do some justice, but we could probably do 10 shows and not cover everything that we want to. We want to thank our guests again, Dr. Candy Leonard, author of Beatleness, now in paperback, How the Beatles and their fans remade the world. Beatleness.com for more information. Dr. Marie Langworthy, editor-in-chief, New Kabaddi Press. Her own website for more information, superwritingservices.com. Professor Phil Gadudy, educator, historian, philgadudy.com. Quinnipiac University, Robert F. Kennedy and the Shaping of the Civil Rights Movement, as well as Kennedy's Kitchen Cabinet and the Pursuit of Peace. And our good friend, actor, director, Kenneth Tiger, a PhD himself in German, correct?
That's right.
That's right. Very good. See, and I'm just the lowly scribe here. So anyway, we thank you.
And I finally have some publications to talk about too.
And we'll have you back on very soon. So we thank you all for joining us, and we thank you out there for joining us for this episode of Studio 411. Everyone hang in there with us, and we will see you next time. Have a great week.